Hi everyone, it's Toby from Toby's Urban Sketch. This little lesson is all about using soluble inks. We're using two different kinds of soluble ink to create a lovely little scene. What it actually is a preview, a demo from one of my Skillshare classes. This one's called Urban Sketching Fundamentals, using pen, ink and line work. As it might sound, it's all about different kinds of pen, different kinds of ink, and how we can use those basics of drawings and sketching to really bring tone, shape and fun to our sketches. If you fancy seeing the whole class, there's a link below which will take you to a Skillshare referral link. Don't feel compelled to do that. I hope you enjoy this. This is one of the free demos as part of that class, along with a load of other lessons in it. Thanks very much. So now we're going to do this scene up here, and we're going to be using some brown ink, a little bit of pink ink, and these are going to be washed with a tiny bit of water, just using any old brush. This is a size 8 round brush. I also might use a little bit of fine liner at the end just to capture some of those shapes in a more rigid way, but we'll see how things progress because sketching is all about being flexible as well. So I'm going to start this time in the middle with this house and just really gently capture these shapes. Remember as well, these shapes, they're going to move, so when we put water on, we're not going to have all the details that we've painfully sketched in at this point, so there's not much point in trying too hard to get this sketch perfect. It's going to move, it's going to wobble around, and the ink is going to get sort of pushed around and thrust places we didn't necessarily intend it, but that's okay because then we can respond to that, and this is where it becomes art rather than a photo. And we can learn as well to control that ink to a greater extent, just with a little bit of practice. So just getting in the important shapes. And these sort of rocks, for example, and then these stairs, which provide a lot of the flow of the image, don't they? They sort of come and they bring a nice sort of curve into the image. We then got this interesting wall. And this is where shapes are really important, because look at how awkward it is. It's really foreshortened, it's going up a slope. But if we just break down the actual wall itself into a series of squares, and those squares just really sort of simply relate to each other, then actually we can build up very easily rather an effective idea of this wall without having to work out really any of that perspective. It just sort of flows together and happens after we've joined up these squares. Part of that is just confidence, not overthinking it, not looking at what you've done and judging it as terrible, because it's probably not right. I'm happy that it looks good enough, and therefore it to me does look good enough. Another important part of the flow of this image, I think, is this sort of coastline, this ridge coming down and joining up here. So an interesting thing to think about with when we know we're going to wash the ink, when we know we're going to move it, is that we need enough of a reservoir of ink for our shadows. So for example, here is shadowed, and in these trees there's lots of shadow. So what we want to do is leave enough line work that when we wash the ink, when we move the ink with our brush, we're going to actually be able to create those shadows because there's enough of an ink reservoir sat on our page. And there we go, a very loose sketch. That's my brown ink done now. And then I'm just going to pick out some nice warm highlights with my pink ink and my purple ink. So these rooftops can be surrounded with pink. And again, I'm going over the top a few times because I know I'm going to wash this ink down, and I want there to be enough ink at the top to wash down. We've also got some lovely little bits of warmth going on in here where there's sunshine. And in this interesting wall, we've got some nice opportunities, I think, for lovely bits of colour to come through. Lastly, let's just do a few touches along our ridgeline. Next, we come in with our water, and I'm going to just control the amount of water on the brush so that we can not lose control of our image. But do you see how immediately you can just activate that ink and produce this lovely wash? This brown will then form this kind of nice, slightly warm, reddy, interesting colour as well, which I think complements this vivid, saturated purple pink. And what we're not doing is flooding the page with water. What we're doing is applying water in a controlled manner and using these patches of colour as little reservoirs to create tone. We can go a bit more random if we want in a few places, but mostly we're trying to actually do it in quite a controlled way. So I want this really shiny side of the building, this bright side of the building, to stay bright. So I'm not going to randomly dot water around too much there. Same here, I want these trees to have a bit of shape. And although they're very, very loosely sketched trees, aren't they? But we can still apply that shape. Same these, remember we drew these shapes? The shapes facing us are dark, the ones facing up are lighter. We can just use a little bit of water and control where our sketched ink goes. In the stairs, just continue those horizontal suggestions with some horizontal line work. And then these lovely bits of pink, which I must confess I'd already forgotten about, but they activate lovely, don't they? They just pop into your face and go, oh, yeah, look at what we did earlier. And there we go. So that's line and wash 1 done. What I like to do is to just go back over things, so we can now just pull out some of these darker lines, and where we think we need a bit more tone, maybe in some windows, we can now, in our second lot of pen work, we can actually introduce even more line work. We can see where things may not have fully worked or fully formed a shadow, and we can give them more shadow. Notice I'm drawing while the page is still a little bit wet, and so things are moving. That's fine, we're going to move them anyway. So it's all about just playing, experimenting with what you've got, what the water and the ink has wanted to do for you, and therefore what you can do with it. Someone gave me a quote, a very interesting quote the other day, which I think is just as relevant to watercolours as it is to ink. They said the pigments are having a party on the page, and that's basically what we're trying to do. We're trying to facilitate this ink to do its thing and create lovely shapes and interest for us. And then maybe a few more touches in here. There's quite a lot of tone in here, isn't there? And then we can come back in again and really simply just enliven again a few of these touches and start to introduce more specific shadows. And what's wonderful about this is that you don't have to carry anything really, even just the one brush and a single fountain pen would be enough to create really interesting tonal art. And it's using our watercolour skills or our shading skills, and you can get a real depth and interest building up remarkably quickly. Now you might wonder if we can do classic things like little splashes, and you can. So if you just pick up some ink, you can easily do similar interesting effects like those splashes. We could vary those splashes, bring in a little bit of our brown ink, and you can also just use the pen as a single reservoir if you really wanted to get bits of deep tone building up somewhere. So perhaps I want to just amp up the tone in this cliff. I just come in and I use my pen as a little paint pot almost. And I said I'd play with a little bit of black ink as well, and let's just do a tiny bit. I don't want to do too much, but just to show you how you can then contrast these warm tones and against something a bit colder, which is black's a very sort of cold feeling tone, isn't it? Something which isn't going to wash and move. And we can just use it to facilitate some of these outlines a little bit more, to outline some of these shapes we've created. We don't need to do much to actually create a lot of interesting effects. Again, feel free to find this controversial, but I'm going to come around with my brown pen this time, and I'm going to use some of these outlines, and I'm going to create a nice little sort of frame, and this frame is just see how we can touch in and outline some of these nice little areas. We can even come around these little flicks. We can come into some of these trees and then out, and suddenly we've got this lovely scene framed, creating this interesting effect for us. So there you go, a little ink sketch using soluble ink this time, no hatching, but using different techniques to build up tone and interest in our ink sketching that we can use as an urban sketching technique.